Committee will come to order. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chair.
We'll pause and allow the amendment to be distributed.
While they're doing that, Mr. Chair, may I ask to be submitted to the record a statement from my colleague, Congresswoman Sinema?
Without objection.
Thank you, sir.
The clerk will report.
Amendment offered by Mr. Heck at the end of Title V.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman from Washington is recognized for 5 minutes to support his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, very much. This is a fairly simple amendment which essentially would require that the Secretary of the Department of HUD develop hiring preference guidelines for the Office of Native American Affairs, or Native American Programs, which is charged with administering NAHASDA, to require consideration of Native American veterans. Now, let me be very clear. They already have a requirement to consider veterans. This would simply require him to develop guidelines to consider Native American veterans. And the reason for my offering the amendment is simple. It will help the program be more successful. That's the flat truth of the matter. This is analogous to a current requirement that we have in the Bureau of Indian Affairs and in Indian Health Services, where they found that it works, to have people who have a deeper, better understanding of the culture. The fact of the matter is that there are contracts required with tribes in order to administer this. There are lots of tribes that don't have them. There's lots of gap yet to be closed in a full integration of this program at HUD and out in the real world, or as we call it in the Northwest Indian country. That's the general problem statement. The more particular problem statement, frankly, is that Native American vets have far and away lower incomes and higher homelessness and higher unhoused needs. But let me also make this point, and those of you who don't have the privilege to represent Indian country may find this somewhat surprising. I'm confident that my friend from New Mexico, Mr. Pierce, will not find this at all surprising. Native Americans volunteer for one of the branches of the armed services at a rate twice as high as their population would suggest. If you have ever been to a ceremony in Indian country of any kind, it doesn't matter. We do a lot with salmon up in the Northwest, so they tend to revolve around that. But here's what they all start with. They all start with a recognition of the Native American veterans in the room, because they're everywhere. The fact of the matter is, notwithstanding what we could legitimately characterize as, frankly, pretty unfair, at times brutal treatment of Indian people over the last 300 years in this land, they still volunteer and always have at twice the rate. So in sum, this is a small amendment, but I offer it, frankly, because it will help NAHASDA be more successful in achieving the goals that we all have stipulated here today and expressed our desire to achieve. And with that, I encourage my colleagues to support this. And I thank you, Mr. Chair, and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. I'm going to oppose the amendment. Already in executive order dated November 9th, 2009, there is a veterans preference by executive order, and indeed in Title V of the United States Code, so both by executive order and by code, we have veterans preferences in employment pretty much throughout the length and breadth of the federal government. This is a policy that I support. Having just viewed this amendment shortly, I'm not certain that we aren't creating brand new ground here that may or may not be good ground to break. And now we are, I believe, breaking the new ground of designating yet a subgroup of veterans for hiring preference. I do not believe that to be a small matter, but a matter that probably deserves careful reflection by this committee, by the Congress. Arguably, this could be construed as a race-based preference as opposed to a recognition of a tribe as a sovereign entity. And so I think that there are a lot of unanswered questions within this amendment. I think it was made aware of it a few hours ago, which is better than a few minutes ago. So I understand what the gentleman is trying to achieve. I certainly honor our veterans and our Native Americans, but going down this road, I think potentially could create incredibly bad precedents that we do not wish to be associated with in race-based preferences, and then picking and choosing among our men and women who have served our nation in uniform and have so tirelessly ensured that we have the freedoms that we enjoy today. To begin that process of picking and choosing among them, I think to be a dangerous precedent. Chair yields back the balance of his time. Anybody seek recognition? Are there any amendments to the amendment? If not, the question is on agreeing to the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed say nay. Nay. In the opinion of the chair, the nays appear to have it. The nays have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other amendments? For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
I have an amendment on the desk.
We'll pause and allow the amendment to be distributed. The clerk will report.
Amendment offered by Mr. Heck, page 9 of the
Without
amendment.
objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman from Washington is now recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This amendment would return us to the status quo, by which I mean it would revert to the original language of the underlying statute, which sets no cap as to the spending amount for NAHASDA. The cap that is included in the proposed legislation, and I want to add my voice to those who commend the gentleman from New Mexico for his arduous work in getting us to this point, frankly is unnecessary. It's unnecessary because obviously whatever amount is expended would be subject to the appropriation level. And again, the effect of my amendment is to embrace the status quo. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but when I went to graduate school and studied political science, I understood that the meaning of a true conservative was one who was slow to adopt change, wanting to build upon all the heritage and cultural consistency of that which came before. So the true conservative position here on this amendment is to embrace it. But that is to say nothing of what the underlying problem statement is. And as the gentlelady from Wisconsin acknowledged before, there is a significant underfunding of the need. The fact of the matter is that the amount that has been expended on NAHASDA programs has not budged, has been flatlined for 11 years at $650 million. If it had only kept pace with inflation, this is separate from the problem statement, which is even greater than the base year appropriation. If it had only kept pace with inflation, what we would have included in here is a spending level of $850 million, not $650 million. I had briefly considered placing that and indexing it into inflation here, but instead opted to choose to refer to the language of the underlying statute as it is currently written. I am confident that as long as the majority party is in charge of the appropriations process on this side, that there won't be any unnecessary appropriation provided for this program, which is, again, significantly underfunded. There aren't too many people that would suggest that the need is not a significant multiple of what the resources being provided are. So all this would do, again, and by the way, I might add that a letter was submitted to the appropriators earlier this year, which was of a bipartisan nature, asking that the amount be adjusted to reflect both the need and the inflationary pressures of the last 11 years. But all this would do is return to the language of current law. It would not spend any more money than the appropriations process provided, but would allow for it, should in their judgment the resources be available. And finally, let me just reiterate that which has been said. The need here is very, very significant. Everybody here understands that the data screams underfunding of the need in Indian country in terms of the number of people who are homeless, the percentage of households that are living in abject poverty, the percentage of households that are, quote, overcrowded by definition, and the like. There is no question but that the need is here to provide more resources. All this amendment says is, let's not arbitrarily flatline this program, not keeping up with inflation for the last 11 years, and certainly not keeping up with the need. And it is in the spirit of attempting to provide robust funding, if possible, that I offer this amendment to strike the arbitrary cap on that which would be authorized. And I urge my colleagues to support, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. When the gentleman speaks of an arbitrary sum, I would take note that this is the sum that was requested in the President's budget. So if it's an arbitrary sum, we could discuss that with the President. In the spirit of trying to be bipartisan, we adopted the number from the President's budget. I would also note that if the gentleman is trying to revert back to some status quo ante, such sums as may be necessary, if that amendment passed, this bill would not be allowed to come to the floor, nor should it. We have a debt crisis in this nation. I know it is something that is not taken very seriously on the Democratic side of the aisle, but we've now had more debt that has been created in President Obama's administration than in the first 200 years of our nation's history. There are a few examples of republics that have existed beyond 200 years. Most have met their demise through some type of fiscal crisis. Let's hope the United States is not among them. But at some point, it is time to quit spending money you don't have, and it's way past time to grow this economy where we are still in the slowest, weakest recovery in our entire nation's history. When our entire economic history is, the more serious the recession, the more serious the degradation of GDP, the stronger and quicker the snapback. But it's the policies that have been supported by this president and many of my friends on the other side of the aisle that still has this economy dragging. So when you say, well, there's not enough funds, well, you're right. Let's get some economic growth going. Let's have some regulatory relief from the Dodd-Frank Act that's absolutely strangling our community banks, keeping people unemployed. So on the one hand, there's nothing done to grow our economy from policies from the other side of the aisle. And then we want to put any modicum of fiscal discipline, which in this case we allowed the President of the United States to define it. It's his sum. It's his figure. And then throw that up into the air, and instead we will deal with such sums as may be necessary. I wonder when we will get such sums as is necessary to retire our federal debt. I'm not sure how many generations that's going to take at its current level. So I would urge all members to defeat this amendment, and if the gentleman from New Mexico would like a little time, I'd be happy to yield to him.
Well, just, Mr. Chairman, I would note that, that in the bill that have been presented by our friends from the other side, that they also have the caps in the bill exactly the way that we do, and so I would just make that one observation and would yield back.
Chairman yields back. For what purpose? The gentleman from Michigan seek recognition.
I move strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I just want to speak in support of the point that's being made, and I know that the gentleman from Washington may have offered a different number. I think it's important that we keep in mind that we're talking about a reauthorization. I don't know when the next reauthorization is likely to come, but I certainly don't think that if we believe that policies that will grow the economy have the effect that the chairman references, and as many of on the other side have said, will result in significantly increased revenues to the federal treasury, that it might be within the prerogative of Congress to decide that a good place to invest would be in the housing programs that this program supports. And I wouldn't want to bind Congress to that number. And I do note that while the number, I don't believe it's artificial, it's rather incongruous that the majority on the committee would embrace the figure proposed by the President, given the fact that very little that he offers has been embraced. But in this case, because it fits the argument, the number is embraced. I would think that the prerogatives of this committee should be exercised by this committee, and we not be in a position where we have to accept the fact that because in this budget year, for reasons that we could get into, we have a limitation in terms of what we could invest in this program that would preclude us from making a different decision next year. Finally, I understand the issue of fiscal responsibility. I think it's really important that we not jump to any conclusions or overgeneralize, and particularly as a new member, to have my position characterized regarding the deficit and the debt. We may have different views as to how we get there. I, for example, would oppose continuing to approve unpaid-for tax extenders that will increase the deficit or force increased revenues or deeper cuts to programs like this one that we all seem to be so committed to support when we go through the reauthorization process. I would be very careful to assume, as the chairman mentioned earlier, that he did not want to do, to assume one's intentions when they take positions such as this. And I wouldn't assume that about Mr. Heck or anybody else on this committee, and I don't assume about it anybody on their side. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Gentleman, yield back. Are there any amendments to the amendment? Question is on agreeing to the amendment. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say nay. Nay. In the opinion of the chair, the nays appear to have it. The nays have it. A recorded vote has been requested. Those in favor of a recorded vote will raise their hand and be counted. Sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is ordered pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules. The vote on this question is postponed. Are there any further amendments? We have all these pending amendments. I just called the previous question, right? Yeah. There being no further amendments, without objection, the previous question is ordered. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 5018 for purposes of markup and move that it be reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 5018 to amend the Federal Reserve Act to establish requirements.
Without objection, the
for
bill is
policy.
considered read and open to amendment at any point. Chair recognizes the Vice Chairman of the Monetary Policy and Trade Subcommittee, Mr. Huizinga, the sponsor of the legislation, to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Over the past several years, the Federal Reserve has gained unprecedented power, influence, and control over the financial system.
I'm sorry, if the gentleman will yield. The clerk will report.
Amendment offered by Mr. Huizinga. Strike all after the enacting clause. Insert the following. Section 1.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read and will serve as base text for purposes of amendment. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thanks again, Mr. Chairman. And, well, as we were saying, the increased power that the Federal Reserve has experienced over the last number of years, especially under the Dodd-Frank Act, has been stunning, and control over the financial system while remaining shrouded to the American people is what's been happening. The standard operating procedure cannot continue. We must lift this veil of secrecy and ensure that the Fed is accountable not just to itself, but most importantly to the people's representatives, which is why my colleague Scott Garrett and I introduced H.R. 5018, the Federal Reserve Accountability and Transparency Act. This legislation will start to pull back the opaque curtain that at the Fed and increase accountability and transparency by doing such things as limiting Fed officials' blackout periods to discuss their policies with Congress, opening the rulemaking process, and requiring the Fed to provide a cost-benefit analysis for every regulation that it issues. Additionally, this legislation urges the Fed to adopt a, quote, rules-based approach to monetary policy instead of the continued ad hoc strategy currently being employed. I sum it up this way. We're going to do what we think we need to do, and please don't ask any questions. I don't think that's acceptable. Should the Fed fail to adopt a rules-based approach, it would trigger an audit of the Fed's books. After receiving beneficial comments from the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve District Banks, we've also incorporated some very constructive changes in the amendment in the nature of a substitute that I'm going to be offering. The amendment would do the following. 1, replace the word audit in the GAO's initial review, determining whether the rule complies with this statute, with a specification that the GAO will prepare a, quote, report of compliance. That's separate from any audit that may happen in the future. 2, a blackout period. This amendment clarifies that the Fed chair will continue to be allowed to conduct her post-FOMC meeting press conferences and public communications. 3, stress testing. The Federal Reserve conducts 2 different stress tests, one pursuant to authority created specifically by Dodd-Frank, and the other is pursuant to its authority predating Dodd-Frank. H.R. 5018 currently only applies to the Dodd-Frank Act stress test. This amendment would then apply to both. 4, cost-benefit analysis. When implementing a rule which the Board is required by statute to adopt, the Board shall further measure costs and benefits against an alternative scenario in which the Board adopts a rule which makes use of all exemptive authority that the Board may have in adopting the required rule. 5, additionally, new language has been added under the cost-benefit analysis, providing that nothing in this section shall apply to the conduct of monetary policy described in Section 2 of the bill. And number 6 of our changes here, international negotiations, providing that, quote, negotiation for the purpose of this section will include any official proceeding or meeting on financial regulation of a recognized international organization with authority to coordinate financial regulation on a global or regional level, including the Financial Stability Board, the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, and the International Association of Insurance Supervisors. Additionally, this amendment reduces the mandatory notification in Section 9 from 90 days to 30 days for those official negotiations. And then finally, 7th, a brand new section amending Section 19B sub 12A of the Federal Reserve Act to add language specifying that the Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC, shall be responsible for setting the rate of interest paid on excess reserves. Mr. Chairman, we cannot have such a powerful entity within the Federal Government operating purely on a whim. This amendment codifies common sense principles with determining monetary policy. It's time to bring the Federal Reserve out of the shadows and provide hardworking taxpayers with a more open and transparent government. I urge my colleagues to vote in support of this amendment. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. While many of the provisions included in Representative Huizinga's amendment clarify the intent of various provisions in the bill, the amendment does little to address the fact that the underlying bill is designed to cripple the Federal Reserve's ability to issue effective and timely regulations and adjust monetary policy based on the complex and ever-changing nature of the world. The most troubling aspects of the underlying bill, which the substitute amendment fails to improve, are contained in Section 2, which requires the FOMC to set monetary policy based on a rule which is subject to troubling GAO reviews and audits. Section 4, which mandates that the Fed give the biggest banks access to its models and methodologies before performing its stress tests, and Section 7, which imposes extreme cost-benefit analysis requirements designed to block all future regulation. With respect to cost-benefit analysis, the substitute amendment makes the underlying bill even more extreme by adding language which would pressure the Federal Reserve to maximize the number of exemptions it is able to provide in cases where the law mandates that the Federal Reserve issue a particular rule. Specifically, the bill requires that the Board of Governors conduct an assessment of the benefits and costs associated with exempting all persons from the application of the proposed regulation to the extent the Board is able. This provision can be read as nothing short of an attempt to block regulation, even where such a regulation has already been required by law. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Are there any amendments to the amendment? The question is on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Yes. For what purpose does the gentlelady seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
We will pause for a moment and allow the amendment to be distributed. Clerk will report.
Amendment offered by Ms. Waters, page 34, after line
Without
8.
objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Although my amendment does not address the litany of strong concerns I have of many of the provisions included in the underlying bill, my amendment does recognize that within the Federal Reserve System, like any institution, there is always room for improvement when it comes to helping traditionally underserved communities. My amendment makes a simple and straightforward change to the consideration that must be given to the selection of each of the 6 directors who serve at the 12 reserve banks across the Federal Reserve System. Yes.
If the gentlelady will take yes for an answer, the chair is prepared to accept the amendment.
The gentlelady accepts yes.
And if the gentlelady will yield. I know that you have given the chairman a yes as author of the bill. I want to enthusiastically accept that as well, and would love to have your support of the underlying bill.
Thank you very much. Oh, well, there's a gentleman whose time it is. It's on my time. I accept.
Gentlelady yields back. The question is on agreeing to the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments to the amendment? If there are no further amendments without objection, the previous question is ordered. The question occurs on reporting the bill at question is on occurring on adopting the amendment in the nature of a substitute favorably to the House. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the bill as amended is ordered reported favorably to the House.
Record a vote on final passage.
Okay. The question now occurs on reporting the bill as amendment favorably to the House. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes, a recorded vote has been requested. Those in favor of a recorded vote will raise their hand and be counted.
1, 2, 3.
The chairman having poor vision at the moment, a sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is ordered pursuant to subsection C5 of Rule 3 of the committee rules. The vote on this question is postponed. The committee will now stand adjourned until 9 a.m. tomorrow morning.